of all the arguments against saving the planet, one of the ones that's always seemed the most absurd to me is we can't afford it. It's like saying we're in a car on a bridge that's about to collapse, but we can't drive off the bridge because the toll would be so high. You know, it just makes no sense to me. But our next guest has made a much more constructive contribution to the debate around saving the planet than I have. Yeva Nersisyan is a professor of economics at Franklin and Marshall College. She is also a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and she is the co-author with L. Randall Wray of a working paper entitled How to Pay for the Green New Deal. It came out in May of this year, and she joins us now. So Professor Nersisyan, thank you for coming on the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And now your paper, well, it begins by explaining that the title mimics the famous book by John Maynard Keynes in 1940, How to Pay for the War, a Radical Plan for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Keynes's point, as I understand it, in writing that book was that the nation faced an existential threat. Conventional thinking about economics could not be used to prevent the nation from defending itself. Here's a better way to look at it. And that better way to look at it was more, and again, this is my lay translation of it, but was to look in terms of the resources available, how to make sure we have the resources to fight the war, and less about what we normally think of as fiscal policy. Am I sort of right about that?
That's right. So what Keynes is basically saying is that planning for the war is not a financial affair. It's a real resource problem. So if we need a certain amount of output for the war effort, and we reach the capacity of the economy, that means there is limited amount left for consumption. So even though workers' incomes would be increasing because more workers are working, they're working more hours, because of the war effort, that income cannot be spent to acquire more real goods. So if workers end up spending all of their income, what's going to happen is that prices are going to go up, but in real terms, they're not going to be able to consume more, right? So what we need to do is we need to find a better way around the problem of inflation, to prevent inflation, that is. So how do we make sure that workers do not spend or waste, in a way, all of their income, and save a portion of it, which they can then spend after the war, when the war effort is no longer going to require resources and more resources will be freed up for consumption, right? So in a way, we prevent inflation during the war, and we provide a boost to aggregate demand after the war, which is usually when we see a slump because the government is withdrawing from the economy, so there is less spending from the government. So in those times, we need more spending, and if workers... Right. So that's Keynes's approach. And to reiterate that planning for something like a war is not a financial affair. So we shouldn't be thinking about raising taxes so that we can pay for the war. We should be thinking about taxes as a way to reduce demand if necessary. And it was necessary, Keynes concluded. And that's what we argue is the way we should think about the Green New Deal and the role of taxes, if necessary, to be used as a way to reduce demand, to create room in the economy for Green New Deal programs.
So what I've seen of the Green New Deal proposals that are out there at the presidential level, we just had the climate debate, for example, among the Democratic candidates, and the Republican candidates don't really have anything approaching the Green New Deal. The most concrete figure I've seen, I've seen these hazy numbers of 10 trillion. That's a combination of public and private spending, which to me means you haven't really answered the question. It's too amorphous. The most concrete number I've seen on the presidential stage anyway is Bernie Sanders' figure of 16 trillion plus for a Green New Deal. How does that fit in with the kind of modeling or thinking that you and Professor Wray did in your paper?
Right. So when we did our paper, Bernie Sanders' plan wasn't out there. We just basically just went off of what was available and what were some other people doing as far as estimates go. So what most people do is they basically take the cost of the program. So they say, okay, if we're going to have to have a Medicare for all, right? How much it's going to cost us, and usually it's over 10 years. How much it's going to cost us over 10 years? So that leads to very large numbers: 36 trillion, 40 trillion, that kind of stuff, right? And what we're saying here is that, well, we can't just take the costs of these various programs that go into the Green New Deal and add them together. Some of these programs are going to be using resources, while others will be freeing up resources. So Medicare for All, for example, is a good example of a program that would be freeing up real resources, which can then be used by other Green New Deal programs. And we have some numbers in our paper where we show that the U.S., and this is well known, is spending a lot more on healthcare than other countries, so something like 18% of GDP. And all of our calculations are in terms of percentage of GDP. So 18% of GDP, while Canada, let's say, spends a little bit over 10%, right? So we're not saying we're going to cut it down all the way to, Canadian levels, but we're saying if we were to have a Medicare for all, we would have cost controls, price controls, right? And it's clear that what's driving the higher spending on healthcare in the U.S. are prices, whether it's prices of pharmaceuticals or, doctors' salaries and so on. So if we could control those, and if we could control administrative costs, because a single payer program like Medicare for All would have lower administrative costs, then we would be saving a lot of resources, which we can then repurpose for Green New Deal programs like greening the economy and that kind of stuff.
And then in terms of, and again, we're talking with Professor Yeva Nersisyan about how to pay for the Green New Deal. What other, so that's 3% of GDP freed up by a more efficient healthcare system under Medicare for All. So that could go to paying for a Green New Deal. You mentioned taxes, and in the explanation to of Professor Keynes, of John Maynard Keynes's how to pay for the war proposal, you also mentioned savings programs and things like that. Where do taxes and possibly savings and other types of policies along those lines fit into your thinking on how to pay for a Green New Deal?
Right. So most people, when they think about the Green New Deal and taxes, they would say, well, we need taxes to finance the spending. And we're saying what Keynes was saying, that we need taxes. Potentially, we may need to use taxes to withdraw demand, right? But that's not clear cut, because people sort of assume that the Green New Deal is going to lead to a higher demand for real resources. We're saying there's a lot of uncertainty about that, right? It may or may not. It depends on how much we'll save from Medicare and how much the greening will actually require and how fast the programs are phased in. So, we should keep in mind that there's a lot of uncertainty there. But assuming there will be increased demand on resources, which could then lead to inflation, right? Because we are competing for somewhat scarce, at least at any given point in time, amount of resources. So if there are inflationary pressures, we need to think of ways to reduce demand. And oftentimes we'll hear proposals like, let's tax the rich so that we can pay for this, right? Well, what we're saying is that, and Keynes was basically saying the same thing, is that you can't accomplish what you're trying to accomplish with taxing the rich, because the goal isn't to find financing. The goal is to reduce demand. And if you tax the rich, that may reduce demand somewhat, but it's not going to be very effective, right? So the kind of taxes that seem to be that could be potentially very popular, just unfortunately aren't the kind of taxes that would be effective in reducing aggregate demand. So what we're saying is that we could have what Bernie Sanders was proposing, at least back then, a payroll tax increase on employees, because that would actually be effective in reducing demand. Now, at the same time, we acknowledge that it's unfair to have workers bear the brunt of the Green New Deal in a way, because wages have been stagnant for the past 50 years or so. So we acknowledge all of that. And that's why we propose to boost Social Security. So workers will be taxed perhaps more today, but once the Green New Deal is in place and we have a better idea of the actual inflationary pressures, because as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty about that, then we can decide whether or not the tax is sufficient. Does it need to be increased, decreased? Maybe it needs to be, completely phased out once the Green New Deal is completely in place. We've accomplished the greening and so on, and we are doing it over a 10-year period, something like that. So we can, get rid of that tax. Just want to make sure that we're clear about that. At the same time, once we are done with phasing in the Green New Deal, we can then start being more generous with Social Security payments. So workers pay more today, but then they get more Social Security benefits, later on. So that would be similar to that would be similar to Keynes's involuntary savings, right? You sort of force savings today, but then you give more spending power in the future when the economy can accommodate that purchasing power.
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to ask you. It sounds like an echo of Keynes and the savings in his proposal. Now, to be fair, when Keynes wrote that book, he didn't know how long a war might last. So he didn't know the period at which this program might end. I guess is the same true of a Green New Deal. In other words, we say is it a 10-year plan after which we assume some freeing up of resources that might lead to an easing of this taxation, or do we not even really? What does your plan assume in your own thinking?
So we go with a 10-year plan, and that's again because other people who are doing estimates were using 10 years, and I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who proposed the Green New Deal to begin with, she was also talking about 10 years, something like that. So of course there is a timeline, but we don't think of it as something that's set in stone, right? You can always, for example, in case of public infrastructure programs, we say that we need to be careful about how we phase them in because there could be resource bottlenecks, which could then create inflationary pressures, which are unnecessary, right? So we can be careful about, how to implement programs and how to avoid resource bottlenecks and inflationary pressures. But in our paper, we have the 10-year projection, right? All of our estimates for resource uses are based on that.
So I guess my final question would be this, and take as much time as you need with it, Professor Nersisyan, but it seems to me, as I sort of reflect on this, that a Green New Deal is certainly there's a resource demand because it's a conversion to solar, it's maybe building a national network of electric railways and so on. But there are certain ways in which I would, and providing jobs and so on, things that would increase demand for resources. But there's a dimension of it that to me would involve lowered use of resources. And I'm not sure where that fits in to all of it, that we stop using fossil fuels to the extent that we've been using them, that we stop using disposable goods to the extent that we're using them, and that sort of thing. And I'm not sure where that fits into all of this, but is there a point at which consumption drops, demand drops, and there's a payoff for everyone?
So we very briefly mentioned that there could be other resource savings. For example, if we are not destroying the environment, then we need to use fewer resources for environmental cleanup, right? So if we are transitioning to technologies that are cleaner, then there's less pollution. So we are going to be spending less. For example, if people are healthier because our energy technologies are safer for humans, right, then we need to spend less resources on healthcare and those kinds of things. So there is that, and we mentioned that in the paper that there's a lot of uncertainty. So this is all basically ballpark numbers, and that's all one can do when we're talking about something as uncertain as transitioning to a completely green economy. The timeline of 10 years, right? There's uncertainties about the costs. For instance, the costs of green energy or greener energy, right? That keeps going down, so that will be a factor as well. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty. What we're trying to emphasize is that we need to move away from thinking in terms of costs and taxes as a revenue source, and to think about this as a real resource issue, and taxes as a way to withdraw demand if necessary, and that may or may not be necessary. But you're right that there will be other resource savings, right? Because we are not going to be, needing this dirty technology. We're not going to be using that anymore. Yeah.
Right.
Did I
Okay.
answer you?
Yes, you absolutely did. And I think about it also in terms of a household, kind of at the micro level, if there may be an upfront investment I mean, I don't like household analogies for the economy, but if someone invests in an electric car, it might be expensive, but then yearly operating costs would be much lower and so on. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. So Professor Yeva Nersisyan, thank you so much for coming on the program. The paper is let me make sure I get it right, How to Pay for the Green New Deal. It's available at the Levy Institute. Thanks for co-writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you. My pleasure.